Welcome back to the Mad Genius Thesis. We always dive into this captivating link between creativity and mental illness.
Mm-hmm.
And today,
Yeah.
we're focusing on the life of Sylvia Plath,
Oh, a fascinating
a
choice.
poet whose style just grabs you,
Yeah.
you know, decades later. And it's still so raw and confessional.
Undeniably powerful.
It really is.
Grappling with those big themes like depression and identity.
Oh,
and
yeah,
of
yeah,
course.
family. Always those intricate family ties.
Absolutely.
And what's really exciting for this deep dive is
Yeah.
we're going beyond just her poetry. We're cracking open Red Comet, the recent biography by Heather Clark. We want to find the woman behind the words.
That's brilliant for our topic. I mean, to truly understand Plath, you need to see her life, her upbringing, her relationships, her struggles, all of it.
Exactly. And then maybe we can start to untangle those threads of creativity and mental health that run through her work.
Woven in, yeah.
So Clark paints this vivid picture of a young Sylvia completely engrossed in a book called A Fairy to Stay.
Oh, interesting.
And it struck me, it's like this early glimpse into her fascination with rebellion.
Really? How so?
Well, the protagonist chopped off her braids to protest her strict aunts.
I see.
Such a small act. But it just echoes those themes of rebellion and control that we see later in Plath's writing.
Fascinating how those early influences can pop up later. It's like a tiny seed planted early on.
It really is.
Yeah.
And speaking of early influences, we can't talk about Plath without talking about her parents.
Right. Otto and Aurelia.
They loom large
They do.
in her life and her work. Otto, who often appears as this,
Yeah.
domineering figure in her poetry,
Right.
he was a German immigrant with this incredible work ethic.
Oh, absolutely. Relentless.
There's this anecdote where he basically took over the dining room table for an entire year
Oh, wow.
while he was writing Insect Societies.
A year.
Can you imagine? Family dinners amidst all that research?
It speaks volumes about his dedication to his work.
Oh, for sure.
Bordering on obsession, you might even say. And from a child's perspective,
Well, yeah.
that single-mindedness could easily come across as distant, even tyrannical.
Absolutely. And it makes you wonder how that dynamic played into those themes of control and confinement that we see in Sylvia's poetry.
Absolutely. It's like she's grappling with that same feeling of confinement, but in a different context.
Right. And it wasn't just his work ethic. Don't forget Otto's experience as a German alien during World War I. All that suspicion, that must have been so isolating.
You can't even imagine to be seen as an outsider, an enemy, just because of where you're from.
It's awful.
It feeds that sense of alienation, and you have to wonder how much that impacted Sylvia's own sense of identity.
Especially considering her own complicated relationship with her German heritage.
Exactly.
It really makes you think about how much his personality, his experiences, shaped Sylvia's perception of him.
A question worth pondering for sure.
And then there's his death. Otto died from cancer when Sylvia was only 8 years old.
Oh, so young.
And he refused to seek any kind of medical help.
Oh, wow.
He was convinced it was terminal.
What a difficult decision.
What do you make of that?
Well, it's complex. On the one hand, maybe it was a final act of control, a way to refuse to succumb to the illness. But on the other hand, it speaks to a fear of medical intervention, maybe rooted in the limited medical understanding of the time. It's fascinating.
This blend of scientific knowledge and personal fear.
Right.
And for Sylvia to lose her father at such a young age,
Devastating.
to witness his decline, his choice to forego treatment, that must have been traumatic.
Absolutely. It's the kind of loss that leaves a mark, a deep psychological imprint that can shape a person's entire worldview and relationships. I wonder how that early experience with death and loss influence those explorations of mortality that she takes on later in her poetry.
Yeah, you always see those themes, absence, longing.
And that fascination with death.
It really does give her work this haunting quality that I think stems from that early loss. And then there's Aurelia, her mother. She seems like this incredibly strong woman.
Yes. Determined to provide for her children and really nurture Sylvia's intellectual curiosity.
You can feel it.
You can.
And she had her own artistic ambitions, which
she set aside to raise her family.
And it makes you think, how did that shape Sylvia's own idea of ambition? Especially as a young woman in the 1950s, a time when societal expectations really clashed with a woman's intellectual pursuits.
That's such a crucial point. On one hand, Sylvia had this role model of a strong, capable woman.
Right.
But then she also saw her mother sacrificing her own creative dreams.
Exactly. Was that inspiring? stifling.
Right. Did she feel empowered to pursue her own path, or did she feel the weight of those unfulfilled dreams?
Such an insightful question, and it makes me think about how those contrasting influences might have fed Plath's own internal conflicts, that push and pull between ambition and societal expectations.
Absolutely.
She's navigating these competing forces, trying to carve out her own space in a world that wasn't exactly welcoming to women with intellectual ambitions.
And don't forget the historical context. The 1950s, while often romanticized,
Sure.
were a time of intense pressure on women to conform.
Oh, absolutely.
Marriage, motherhood, domesticity. And Sylvia, with her intellect, her creative drive,
Yeah.
clearly chafed against those constraints.
Oh, you can feel it in her writing.
That tension.
That struggle to reconcile her own desires with what society was telling her to do. And I think it's within this context that we start to see these early signs of Sylvia's struggles with mental health.
Yes, definitely. It really is fascinating how these early experiences with her parents, those contrasting influences
Yeah.
of ambition and sacrifice, almost like they lay the groundwork for Plath's later struggles.
Right. And of course, there's her time at Smith College.
Smith.
It feels like a real turning point.
Yes.
Both for her creative development and her mental health.
It's like everything's colliding, her ambition, her anxieties, all the pressures of the time.
Right. All shaping her as a writer, as a woman.
Exactly. And you can see that playing out so clearly during her time at Smith.
Absolutely.
Smith was intellectually stimulating.
Oh, yeah.
But also incredibly competitive. And Plath thrived on that challenge.
She did. She was winning awards, getting published.
17 magazine, right.
Yeah. But all that pressure to succeed, combined with those anxieties she already had,
Right.
seems to have taken a real toll.
It's almost like her creativity and her vulnerability were feeding off each other, intensifying both the highs and the lows.
Yeah.
And that's when we see the first major breakdown, her suicide attempt during her junior year.
It's a harrowing episode, and Clark really goes into detail.
Drawing on journals and medical records.
Right. Even interviews with people who knew her back then.
You really get a sense of how overwhelmed she felt by everything.
The demands of her academic life, the expectations, and of course her own internal struggles.
It makes you think, for our deep dive into the Mad Genius Thesis, was this breakdown simply a result of all that pressure, or was it somehow linked to her creative drive, to the intensity of her emotions, her unique way of experiencing the world?
That's the question, isn't it? It's like we're trying to untangle this knot of interconnected threads.
It really is.
Was her sensitivity, her ability to feel so deeply, both a source of her creative brilliance and a contributing factor to her mental fragility?
It's impossible to say for sure.
Right.
But what we do know is that Plath's suicide attempt wasn't an isolated incident.
It wasn't.
Her journals from this time are filled with dark imagery.
Yeah, expressions of despair and this preoccupation with death.
It's like she's wrestling with these huge existential questions.
Right, the meaning of life and death and those themes become so prominent in her writing.
Exactly. And in the aftermath of her attempt, she undergoes treatment at McLean Hospital, a psychiatric facility known for treating well-known artists and writers.
Right.
It makes you wonder, was there something about the creative personality that made them more susceptible to mental illness?
That's a really interesting thought.
Isn't it? Are artists more prone to mental illness? Or does their sensitivity simply make them more aware of their struggles?
Right. It's that age-old debate.
A complex issue.
Sure.
But what's fascinating is that Plath's time at McLean,
Yeah.
while obviously difficult,
Sure.
was also a period of intense intellectual and creative exploration.
She was reading constantly, immersing herself in Dostoevsky, James Joyce.
Oh, wow.
It's like she sought solace and inspiration in the words of other artists who had faced those same themes.
Those themes of darkness, existential angst.
You can definitely see those influences in her later work.
Absolutely.
She absorbed those styles, those dramatic concerns, and wove them into her own voice.
It's like she's building on the foundation of her literary heroes, but also pushing the boundaries,
Yes.
forging her own path.
And it's during this period that we see a real shift in her writing. It gets bolder, more confessional. She's more willing to explore those darker aspects of the human experience.
Absolutely. And it's no coincidence that this coincides with her meeting Ted Hughes.
Oh, Ted Hughes.
That relationship would have such a profound impact on her life and her work, for better or for worse.
One of those captivating and tragic love stories.
They were both brilliant poets drawn to each other's intensity and creativity.
It's true, but their relationship was also volatile.
Passion, competition, and ultimately betrayal.
Even their first meeting is almost legendary.
Oh, tell me about it.
A party, lots of alcohol, poetry flowing.
Right, this whirlwind of creative energy and attraction.
Hughes was already a rising star.
Yes, his poems were so raw, so visceral.
Full of that primal energy.
That Plath found exhilarating and intimidating.
Yeah, I wonder how their contrasting styles influenced each other. Plath with her meticulous craft.
Yes.
Her focus on form and structure.
And Hughes with his instinctual, almost shamanistic approach. Like two sides of the same creative coin.
Yeah, and that tension, that creative friction.
It's all over their work from this period.
You can see it.
Plath's poetry becomes more daring, she experiments more with form and language, and she's grappling with the complexities of their relationship.
Absolutely. And it's not just her style that's evolving.
Right.
Her themes get darker, more intense, the raw emotions of love, desire, jealousy, that struggle of being a wife, a mother, and an artist.
And these themes, while so personal, also reflect those anxieties at the time.
Yeah, the Cold War, nuclear annihilation, women fighting for equality.
It's all there.
Plath's poetry becomes this mirror.
Right.
Reflecting not just her own struggles, but the fears of an entire generation.
You can feel that unease.
Yeah, an undercurrent of anxiety running through her work.
And amplified by her own struggles with mental health.
Definitely. The depression, the anxiety.
The nightmares come back.
And there's this growing sense of isolation, even as she's finding success as a writer, as a wife, as a mother.
It's like she's caught in a whirlwind.
Trying to balance her ambition with family life and those societal expectations.
And then it all comes crashing down.
With Hughes's affair.
That she weevil.
The betrayal is devastating.
It shatters her already fragile state.
It's heartbreaking to read about this period.
Knowing the tragic ending.
But it's also awe-inspiring to witness this creative energy that comes out of all that pain.
It's like she's channeling all her rage, her grief, her despair into her writing, transforming it into something powerful.
It's almost as if writing became this lifeline for her, during those last few months.
A way to process the pain,
the betrayals,
all those intense emotions.
And her poetry from this period.
It takes on this even rawer quality.
It does. There's a real ferocity to her language.
This unflinching honesty in her exploration of themes like rage and abandonment.
Right, and even the disintegration of the self.
Exactly.
And it's here that her exploration of female identity, particularly through motherhood, becomes even more complex. She's grappling with all these societal expectations.
You know, the pressure to be a wife and mother.
In a society that didn't really value women's intellectual or creative ambitions.
Absolutely. But she's also confronting those internal struggles.
Right. The desire to nurture and to create.
To conform and to rebel.
It's a battle so many women artists face even today.
It is. This feeling of being pulled in so many directions.
Trying to balance motherhood with the need to create.
And for Plath, all of that is amplified by the breakdown of her marriage.
Right, the loss of her support system.
She's stripped bare, forced to confront those deep fears and insecurities.
And that vulnerability, that rawness.
That's what makes her poetry from this period so powerful, so unsettling.
It's true, and you see it so clearly in a poem like Daddy.
Daddy, yes.
This explosive, almost violent confrontation with patriarchal authority.
That's powerful.
With the legacy of her father. And with all those societal forces that try to control and define women.
I think she's using language as a weapon to reclaim her power, her voice in a world that tried to silence her.
And it's not just the themes, it's the language itself.
It's so visceral, almost physical.
You can feel the rage, the pain, that fight for liberation.
Exactly.
It's like she's taking those societal expectations, those imposed roles, and shattering them with her words.
And that theme of rebellion, of pushing back against those constraints.
You see that echoed in her exploration of female sexuality, too.
Oh, absolutely.
Poems like Lady Lazarus and Ariel.
So daring, so unapologetic.
Confronting those ideas of female desire and agency.
And we can't forget the historical context.
Of course.
That early 1960s,
right.
Women were still largely defined by their relationships to men.
As wives and mothers.
Exactly. And Plath's poetry challenged those norms.
Demanding recognition of women's inner lives, their desires, their ambitions.
Their darkness, too.
And in doing so, she really paved the way for so many women writers who came after her.
To explore those themes with more freedom, more honesty.
It's true. But it does make you wonder, Was Plath's exploration of her own darkness,
Mm-hmm.
her descent into despair,
Yeah.
was that somehow essential to her creative genius?
That's the core of our discussion, isn't it? Is there a
Yeah.
connection between suffering and art?
It's so tempting to romanticize that mad genius idea,
It is.
to see her tragic end as inevitable.
Like a price for her brilliance.
But that feels like an oversimplification.
It is. It's dangerous to fall into those easy answers.
Plath's story is complex.
It defies categorization.
What we can say is that her creativity and her mental health were undeniably linked.
They were.
Her poetry was both an escape and a reflection of her inner turmoil.
It allowed her to process that pain, to give voice to those fears and desires.
But it also exposed her vulnerability.
Yes, her rawness.
And that's ultimately what makes her work so powerful, so relatable even today.
It's true.
She doesn't shy away from those difficult parts of human experience.
The darkness, the ugliness, the messiness.
She embraces it all and forces us to confront it with her.
Her final collection, Ariel, published after her death.
Right.
It's a testament to that power.
It really is.
This collection that swings between despair and ecstasy, rage and tenderness.
A celebration of life and a confrontation with death.
Exactly.
And it leaves us with this question. Would Plath have reached those creative heights without also going through those depths of despair?
Was her genius bound to her suffering? We can't know for sure.
It's a question without an answer.
But what we can learn from Plath's life and her work is this. Creativity and mental illness, they exist on a spectrum.
They do.
They can coexist, influence each other, sometimes even fuel each other.
But it's so important to remember that mental illness isn't a requirement for artistic brilliance.
It's not, and romanticizing that connection can be dangerous.
Absolutely.
I think as we wrap up this deep dive into Sylvia Plath's world, the biggest takeaway is the need for empathy and understanding.
Right.
And a nuanced perspective when we talk about that relationship between creativity and mental illness.
It's so complex.
Plath's legacy is complex, it's challenging, and it's enduring.
Her voice, so raw and unflinching.
It's going to keep resonating with readers for years to come.
I think you're right.
Forcing us to grapple with those big questions about creativity, the power of language, and the resilience of the human spirit.
And that wraps up another episode of the Mad Genius Thesis. We hope you found this exploration of Sylvia Plath insightful and thought-provoking.
Absolutely.
Join us next time for another deep dive into that fascinating
And sometimes fraught.
relationship between creativity and mental illness.